Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Skybound Capital's podcast series, Under the Macroscope, where we take a look at various macro issues affecting global economies and, in some cases, how we make investment decisions. And joining me on the podcast today is Skybound Capital's Chief Investment Officer, Theodore Xu, who is usually based in the Hong Kong office of the business, but at the moment is in Shanghai. And we thought it was an opportune time to tap the expertise, the brain, the knowledge of our Chief Investment Officer on certain matters to do with China. And we thought, in a slightly light-hearted way, we could play a little game of Mythbusters, because there are a lot of things that circulate in the news about the way China is operating at a macro level. And we thought no better person than he, with his feet on the ground, to either agree with some of these rumors or statements about China and their operations, or indeed to bust the myth, so to speak. So, Theo, great to have you on the podcast again. And we've just come to the end of the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing. And something that caught my eye as a big sports fan was more and more Chinese sportswear. So one of the things that we hear often is that Chinese manufacturers are simply knocking off bigger name brands and producing them at much cheaper prices. Tell us about this. Are these Chinese sportswear brands that we're seeing more and more of simply Nike and Adidas copycats?
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm happy to be here. And the quick answer is they were. They certainly were for a long period. But you're right. Take the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics, for example. The usual suspects like Nike and Adidas were seldom seen at all. Most of the national teams were wearing branded gowns and sportswear. And what's interesting is that many of them are Chinese branded. So those Chinese brands, take the leading brands, for example, Anta, Li Ning, they were rooted from the late 80s, early 90s. So they're not necessarily much younger than Nike. However, for a very long period, you're absolutely right that even the largest Chinese sportswear brands were trying to copycat the international leaders. However, this is no longer the case in recent years. And that's why they are more and more recognized by global sports people. Who are choosing them to be wearing them as well. And a lot of these Chinese brands are spending tremendous amount of money into R&D. Therefore, nowadays, their shoes could actually be more techy than some of the leading global brands. Their sportswears are also, in many ways, more sophisticated than their competitors. Even in terms of price points, in the past, when we talk about knockoffs, they're supposed to be cheap. But that's no longer the case with many of these Chinese sportswear. On many occasions, they are actually priced more expensively than Nike or Adidas. So that myth was a fact for a long period, but it no longer is.
Basket. We're going to jump around to a lot of topics today, Theo, for obvious reasons. And we would encourage our listeners and our subscribers to the podcast to get involved. If you pick up on something that Theo is talking about that you like some more information about, please do get in touch. We're putting email addresses and links to the Skybound Capital website throughout the course of these podcasts, and we really would encourage you to get in touch, ask some questions. We do like the interactive nature of these things. So, Theo, from sportswear, I want to go in a completely different direction to property. We hear stories of literal ghost towns in China, cities by any modern standard, standing empty, unoccupied, and the thought that a property bubble bursting is inevitable in China. And we spoke on a previous podcast in 2021 about Evergrande and the falling of that giant, so to speak. Where are we at in terms of the property market and the Chinese ghost towns?
Sure, I'd love to talk about the Chinese ghost towns because in the past 10 years, or even longer than 10 years, we've seen analysts chanting about those ghost towns and singing the songs of China going to an end or Chinese properties going to an end. Though none of those have really materialized into the doomsday for Chinese properties as yet, at least. Those ghost towns definitely were existing, so those are not a myth. But what's important is that you need to compare the value of those ghost towns to the value of the more valuable assets in China, the more valuable properties in China. Let's jump out of the residential market for a second and compare the office space. Shanghai is where I am in now, is a small city with roughly 30 million people. It is small in terms of its proportional population as opposed to the entire population of China, right? That's only less than 2%, or sorry, 2.5% of the Chinese population. But the office market value or the office property value of Shanghai alone is almost 15 to 20% of all offices in China. And this is well justified because Shanghai is the business center and things in Shanghai are generally more expensive anyway. And the same logic applies to residential properties too. Yes, you will be seeing a lot of ghost towns in many parts of rural China, but those properties are of much less value compared to, let's say, one simple residential complex in Beijing or Shenzhen or Shanghai in the top tier cities. Therefore, I think investors shouldn't be worrying too much about the so-called ghost towns, even though those are visible. You can literally see them, and they're showing all types of videos. But back to the question on the property market in China in general, I think it was a good deleveraging process that we were seeing in the past 2 years. Yes, we are seeing the fall of Evergrande together with many of the private-owned developers. And that trend will continue for a while, for probably the next year or two. But still, we do not believe Chinese properties are going to zero. And we still see tremendous investment opportunities in the market too.
Well, I suppose very closely linked to property is population growth. And perhaps you can cast some light for us on the child policy. There was a long-standing one-child policy in China. There's been a shift away from that. What is that? What effect is that having on future population growth in China? Are you seeing, with the lifting of that policy, a tangible change?
We were hopefully seeing so for a very short period back in 2015 and 2016. So when the one-child policy was first removed, the birth rate in China literally picked up quite tremendously over a period of 1 or 2 years. However, that trend has been reversed again. So it is still now downwarding. Birth rates are coming down every single year. Back to our property analysis, I suppose that this definitely is more disappointing or negative for the long-term residential properties. I don't think Chinese population is going to decrease very quickly to a much smaller number, but we are most likely seeing an inflection point this year where the total population of China actually will peak this year. Starting from next year, we're seeing less and less people in China. But that doesn't really defy the analysis that we had that China will still see opportunity in the property market. It's not necessarily only in residential. We are seeing many opportunities across other types of properties. And even in residential, we see a lot of upgrades.
Busted.
Yeah, let's move on to the corporate world. I want to bring two issues together again, which are sort of commonly communicated issues in the media that certainly that we consume. around US listed Chinese companies, so-called massaging their financials. This is a claim that's made. It's an accusation that's been made. And in parallel with that, the US running a so-called entity list onto which we are seeing more and more Chinese companies being added and being blacklisted because of possible military ties. Can you explore some of that? I know it's a very broad topic and difficult to summarize in a couple of minutes, but
sure,
if you could.
Totally. I mean, it can be quickly summarized into two different aspects. One is really on the financials. You're right that we're seeing some scandals centered around Chinese companies listed in the US, or normally what we call them financial shenanigans. And honestly, those are not confined to Chinese companies only. You can see companies cook their books everywhere. They come to the spotlight more, I think, because one, the intensifying China-US relationship, two, also the fact that many Chinese companies are much bigger than some of the other scandals that you see elsewhere. Therefore, when they explode, they create more a market impact and they get more attention naturally. But I don't think it is the intention of the state to push dodgy companies to the US. It is a natural selection that what's interesting is that a lot of international investors probably do not realize this, that the listing rules in China are much stricter than the listing rules in the US or in Hong Kong. Therefore, some of the Chinese companies that will not be eligible for an IPO within China, hence they choose to go elsewhere. They choose to go to places where they can get more easily listed. And as a result of that, it's possibly more likely you see such scandals and sagas in the offshore listed Chinese companies compared to the home listed Chinese companies. But again, Stu, as I said, I don't see a significantly larger portion of Chinese companies cooking their books compared to any other countries or other markets. It really is more about attention. And back to the entity list, that's more in the political circle. But you're right, it impacts the corporate world. A typical example is something I guess a lot of our audience might also know, a drone brand called DJI. Many consumers buy those drones for taking photos and videos from high above. And that company was listed into the entity list by the US a few times in the past. And for those who do not understand the entity list, that basically is a very long list that US publishes every now and then, which covers all the companies that are deemed as of national threat or national risk to the US. So as I said, DJI was listed on that entity list every now and then, and US banned purchases of DJI equipments within US military, which is interesting because a lot of those companies were listed on that list because of their claimed ties or relationship with Chinese military. But the fact is US military also purchases DJI drones in large quantity. Actually, US Air Force publicly announced that they acquired those drones. And Finland massively used DJI drones in their military as well. So we see many interesting clashes, which are not necessarily really because of the roots that they were attributed to. And of course, there were other examples like Huawei and other Chinese companies. Would you say all of them have military ties with the Chinese military? I would say maybe part of them, but not necessarily all of them. And also it depends on how you define ties. For example, I'm sure Intel chips are widely used in many equipments or any PC that is used in US military. But would you say that Intel has a close tie with the US military? Probably not. And that same logic applies to many Chinese companies that are on that list. So I think it is partially unfair to have all these companies on the entity list, but that is, again, a result of the intensifying US-China relationship.
Fascinating. And again, if we can encourage you, if you're finding some of what Theo is talking about on this podcast interesting, you'd like further information, please do get in touch, ask questions, make statements. We're always willing to debate these kind of topics. Theo, just staying on the topic of the sharing of information, I think it would be impossible to have a discussion on the podcast around perceptions of China without addressing COVID, which has impacted everyone across the planet for the better part of 2 years now, and various claims and accusations of falsifying of numbers, hiding numbers. What is the COVID situation in your lived experience in China right now?
I think my physical location is a good evidence of the COVID situation in China in a way. We relocated the majority of our Hong Kong team to mainland China from a few months ago, partly for business reasons, but partly for health reasons. Since our relocation, Hong Kong has deteriorated into a hot pot of COVID cases. We are on average seeing roughly 10,000 cases a day in Hong Kong, a small city of 7 million population, versus less than 100 cases a day in China, where you have 1.4 billion people. And I can testify to that because I live a normal life in Shanghai, which you cannot in Hong Kong. Hong Kong just announced that all schools will start their summer vacation in a week time, which is still early spring. And so we don't have any disruption of life, work in mainland China so far. COVID is very well contained. I think in the intermediate term, it presents threats to the economic activities, not necessarily domestically, but particularly the external relationship. So in the past few years, China benefited from the slowdown in the rest of the world by exporting more and more. But the physical separation between China and the rest of the world, I think, will ultimately weigh on the economy.
But that said, having watched a lot of the Winter Olympics, as I said at the start of the podcast, it was obviously a very, very strictly controlled environment at every turn.
China put a lot of resources into this. You literally have your neighborhood watch, which is not for burglars, but rather for COVID cases. And so I think this is not an approach that is replicable elsewhere, because it has a lot to do with culture. It has a lot to do with how the society is structured. Some people might attribute this to politics. No, I don't think so. It really is very unique to this society.
Yeah, well, what's fascinating, Theo, always talking to you, especially when you are living your everyday life in mainland China, is just having this opportunity to perhaps bust a few myths, but also to hear from you some of the narrative that plays out in the media that we consume that has elements of truth to it, but always good to do the fact checking. And thank you once again for your time on Under the Macroscope, which as a podcast series can be downloaded on Apple, on Spotify, or on the Google podcast platform for Android. And all editions of Under the Macroscope are available on Skybound Capital's website at www.skyboundcapital.com. We look forward to you joining us on the next edition of Under the Macroscope. Thanks as always for your participation in the podcast Under the Macroscope, hosted by Skybound Capital, which has offices here in South Africa, where I am based, London, Hong Kong, Mauritius, and Australia, and providing a variety of wealth advisory and fund management solutions. And one of those fund management solutions is run by Theodore Xu out of the Hong Kong office, and where he is based in Shanghai at the moment, called the Innovation Fund. And you can find more information about that fund at www.skyboundcapital.com.